The upper hall at Cairnmore House was 30 feet of cold marble at 1 in the morning, and Lysandra Weir had crossed it 100 times in 3 years without once setting the silver tray down before she reached Lady Winifred's door. She was crossing it now, the tisane steaming faintly, her steps as quiet as she had learned to make them on stone, when she heard Aldrich's voice through the half-open library door, easy and unhurried, the voice of a man speaking to a friend in his own house at the end of a long evening. She heard Lord Everard say something she could not distinguish. She heard Aldrich laugh, low and certain, and then she heard every word that followed with the particular clarity of a sentence that lands before the mind has had time to prepare itself. "I can do whatever I want," he said. "She'll stay. Women in her position do." Lysandra did not stop walking. She did not adjust her grip on the tray. The tisane reached Lady Winifred's room at the correct temperature, was set on the correct table, and Lady Winifred was wished a quiet night in the correct tone. Then Lysandra went to her own room, closed the door, and stood in the dark for perhaps 30 seconds before she moved to the wardrobe and began to pack. She worked without a candle. She had lived in this room for 3 years and knew where every object was. The small trunk under the bed, the folded winter cloak on the upper shelf, the leather satchel she had carried from Edinburgh when she came. She worked by feel and by the habit of a woman who had grown up in a dispensary, where every drawer had its place, because her father had taught her that a thing misplaced at midnight could mean a thing unfound at need. Her hands were steady. She noticed that they were steady and did not remark on it, even to herself. The Culpeper came first, her father's copy, the spine repaired twice in his lifetime and once in hers, the margins annotated in 2 hands. Then the silver étui Lady Winifred had pressed on her at 28, which she had tried 3 times to refuse and finally kept because Lady Winifred had said, with the particular firmness of old women who have decided, "It was my mother's, and it should be used by someone who will use it." Then the brass apothecary's scales, each pan nested in its cloth, the whole instrument folded into a handkerchief that she tied at the corners and set at the top of the satchel, where it would not shift. The 17 shillings were already in the cloak lining. She had sewn them there 6 months ago on an evening she had not fully examined at the time. A practical woman making a practical provision, she had told herself, without asking what the provision was for. She dressed for travel. She wrote the note for Lady Winifred at the small writing table by the window, 4 sentences, the candle lit only long enough to write them, and then extinguished. She carried the satchel and the trunk to the kitchen garden gate by 2 separate trips, moving through the back passages that she knew as well as the main corridors, because a companion learns the shape of a house from its service routes as much as its public rooms. The gate opened onto the lane without sound. She pulled it shut behind her, heard the latch drop, and walked toward the Jedburgh Road without looking back at the house. The mail coach left at 4. She had 2 hours, and she walked the first mile of them in the dark along a road she had ridden many times with Aldrich in the gig, past the stone wall where the field dropped away to the lower pasture, past the stand of ash trees that marked the boundary of Cairnmore's home farm. She had been on this road in every season. She had been on it in the rain in October, when Aldrich held the umbrella over both of them because she had left hers in the gig. A small domestic act that she had not thought much about at the time, because there had been a great many such acts across 12 months. And it was only now, walking alone in the dark with her father's scales and a handkerchief in her satchel, that she understood what she had been doing with them. Collecting them, holding them, building from them an understanding of a man that the man himself had not authorized. She had asked him on the second night. She remembered it precisely. The fire low, hers sitting up against the bolster with the kind of directness that had always been easier for her in the dark. "When you marry," she had said, "this ends. You understand that?" And he had said yes, warmly, easily, the yes of a man agreeing to something he considered already settled and therefore not requiring much thought. She had taken it as a promise. She had not known then that his yes rested on a different understanding entirely. That in his accounting, the question of ending did not arise because the question of leaving did not arise. And the question of leaving did not arise because women in her position did not leave. His mother had not left. Ergo, she had not known about his mother. She knew only what she had heard through the half-open door. And what she had heard was enough. 3 weeks before the night of the hook, Aldrich had fastened the button of her left driving glove at the wrist. It was a small thing. Her right hand had held the rein. She had been about to take the gig out to Mrs. Pettifer's sister in the village. And the button had come loose, and Aldrich had been standing beside the gig, and he had simply taken her wrist in both his hands and done it. Not tenderly, particularly. Practically in the way of a man who noticed what needed doing and did it without making an occasion of it. She had looked at his hands on her wrist for a moment, before she gathered the rein and clicked the horse forward. And she had thought, without quite admitting the thought, this is what it would be to be known by someone. On the Jedburgh mail coach before dawn, Lysandra took the driving gloves off. She set them on the bench beside her. She looked at them for a moment in the gray light beginning at the coach window, and then she looked away and did not pick them up again for the remainder of the journey. The arrangement had been 12 months in the making and 12 months in the keeping. She had not entered it carelessly. She had been a companion for 3 years before it began, and in those 3 years she had watched Aldrich with the attentiveness of a woman trained to observe. Her father had taught her that diagnosis began before the patient spoke, in the way they held themselves, in what they did with their hands, when they thought no one was looking. She had watched Aldrich, and she had understood him to be a decent man. She had not been wrong about that. Decent men could hold wrong doctrines as easily as cruel ones, and were sometimes harder to leave because the decency was real and the doctrine invisible until it spoke aloud through a half-open door at 1 a.m. Her father's dispensary on the Cannon Gate had been the kind of practice that treated the women his male colleagues would not discuss in daylight. The complaints that had no polite name, the pregnancies that ended badly, the ailments that came from lives lived in 2 small rooms with too many people and not enough food. He had trained her in all of it. He had trained her because she was there and because she was capable, and because he had, she thought, simply forgotten to consider whether a daughter ought to be trained differently than a son. He had died when she was 22 and left her the instruments, the library, and a lease on the dispensary that she could not afford to keep. She had come to Cairnmore at 26 as Lady Winifred's companion. She had reduced 12 years of her father's teaching to household remedies and the management of an elderly woman's comfortable ailments. And she had told herself, on the evenings when this sat badly, that she was practical, and that practical was sufficient. The night of the hook, she had understood that she had been repeating her mother's life in nicer rooms. Her mother, widowed at 34, had kept house for a kind merchant and survived 31 years more, without once, so far as Lysandra had ever seen, doing anything she had chosen for herself. She had died at 51, comfortable and careful and entirely spent. Lysandra had watched it happen over the slow years of her childhood and had sworn, with the specific fervor of a girl who does not yet know how quietly repetition arrives, that she would not do the same. The mail coach moved north into the dark. The note was already on Lady Winifred's nightstand. The kitchen garden gate was latched behind her, and the house was growing smaller at her back with every mile. And Lysandra sat with her hands in her lap and her father's Culpeper in the satchel at her feet, and the driving gloves on the bench beside her, and did not look at either. The Jedburgh posting inn was lit by 2 tallow candles in the public room, and smelled of cold ash and the morning's first bread not yet baked. Lysandra arrived at 3:30, set her trunk against the wall, and sat down at the long table to wait for the northbound connection. The room was empty. Somewhere in the back of the inn, a dog shifted and resettled. The fire had been built up recently and was beginning to catch. The ostler's wife came through from the kitchen passage with a cup of tea and a short candle in a tin holder, and set both on the table in front of Lysandra without asking whether she wanted them. She was a broad woman of perhaps 50, wearing her day dress over her nightgown because she had not yet had time to change. And she looked at Lysandra with the particular look of a woman who has seen a great many people arrive at posting inns at 4 in the morning and has learned to read what it means. She set the cup down, and then she placed her hand briefly on Lysandra's shoulder. Not patting, not pressing, simply resting there for a moment. And then she went back to the kitchen without speaking. Lysandra sat with the cup between her palms, and her hands shook. They shook for 20 minutes. She noticed this with the same observational distance with which she noticed everything. Her hands were shaking, the tea was hot, the candle was burning down. She had taken the handkerchief with the apothecary's scales out of the satchel without quite intending to, and was holding it in both hands. The brass weight of the folded instrument barely more than a few ounces, but present, specific, her father's. She held it until her hand steadied. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father died, and she did not cry now. And she did not examine why. Because examining it would have meant going somewhere she could not afford to go in a public room at a coaching inn at 4 in the morning, with a northbound connection to catch. The fire was fully lit by the time the sky at the small window began to separate from black into something that was merely dark. Lysandra set the handkerchief and its contents back in the satchel, drank the remainder of the tea, which had gone cool, and sat with her hands flat on the table. She thought about the note. She had written it in 4 sentences, and she had not read it back before she folded it, because she had known that reading it back would have meant changing it, and changing it would have meant softening it, and softening it would have meant leaving a door that she was not willing to leave open. She thought about whether she could send for it. She thought about this for perhaps 30 seconds, and then she stopped thinking about it. Because the answer was no. Not because she could not practically send for it, but because sending for it would mean returning, and returning would mean standing again in that hall with a tray in her hands and the sentence in her ears. And she found that she could not make her mind place herself there. The door was closed. She had closed it. She would not open it again. When the ostler called the northbound coach, Lysandra picked up her satchel, lifted her trunk by the handle, and walked out of the inn into the gray beginning of the morning. She did not look back at the public room or the candle still burning on the table. She handed her trunk up, took the step, and sat down on the bench inside the coach as it lurched forward. And the inn fell behind, and the road opened north, and she was on it. Glen Strathorrin was a parish of 600 souls in a valley between 2 hills, with a stone church, a manse, a mill, and the kind of poverty that was not dramatic. but was entirely present in every house Lysandra entered in her first month. She arrived in the second week of November with her satchel and her trunk and a letter she had written on the coach, introducing herself to Reverend James Balfour as a trained apothecary's daughter seeking to establish a dispensary practice in a parish that, she had been told at the Jedburgh Inn, had no resident physician within 12 miles. Reverend Balfour was 54, lean and direct in the manner of a man who had served a rural parish long enough to have stopped pretending that difficulty was not difficult. "You are unmarried," he said, not as an accusation, sitting across from her in the manse parlor with her letter in his hand. "I am," Lysandra said. "An unmarried woman practicing medicine, what passes for medicine, in a parish where half the men still think a female physician is a thing that belongs in a city." He set the letter down. "They'll come when they're desperate enough. The question is whether you can survive until they are." "I have 17 shillings and the instruments," Lysandra said. "I can survive some time." Balfour looked at her for a long moment. "There is a stone building beside the churchyard wall that was a weaver's cottage until last year. The roof is sound. I will permit you the use of the name Mrs. Balfour for parish purposes. It will help, and it costs me nothing I cannot spare. In exchange, I ask that you treat any parishioner who presents themselves, whether they can pay or not, and that you tell me if any situation arises that is beyond your skill." "Agreed," Lysandra said. "And if anyone asks about your history?" "I will tell them I am a widow," Lysandra said, "which is near enough to true." Balfour did not ask her to explain that. He stood, held out his hand, and she shook it. And that was the beginning of the dispensary at Glen Strathorrin. She opened on a Thursday in December, which was too cold to be comfortable and too near Christmas for anyone to come for anything but emergencies. In her second month, she was called to Reverend Balfour's sister, Mrs. Ada Balfour, who had a pleurisy that had gone 3 weeks without proper treatment and was, by the time Lysandra arrived at her door, in a state that should by rights have killed her. Lysandra worked through 2 nights with mustard poultices and a fever management that she had learned from her father's notes on a similar case in 1803. On the 3rd morning, Mrs. Ada Balfour's fever broke. She looked up at Lysandra from the pillow and said, with the bluntness of a woman who had just decided to continue living, "You're very young to know that much." "My father was thorough," Lysandra said. After that, word moved through the tenants in the way that word moves through small parishes. Not quickly, but completely. By March, the dispensary was no longer empty. She was busier than she had been in 12 years. She was busier than she had been since her father was alive. And the work was the same work. The women's complaints, the winter chest ailments, the injuries from farming and fishing, and the ordinary violence of rural life. And she did it with the same instruments and the same knowledge. But now she did it under her own hand, in her own building, on her own credit. And the difference between that and what she had been doing at Cairnmore was not subtle. It was the difference between a fire kept banked and a fire burning at full draw. In month 6, on a Wednesday afternoon in May, a girl appeared at the dispensary door. She was 10 years old, and she came in without knocking, which was how Lysandra knew she was frightened, because children who are not frightened always knock. She climbed onto the treatment table, and she took Lysandra's hand. Not for comfort, but purposefully, turning it palm up and then placing her own hand on top of it so that Lysandra could see the cut along the base of her fingers. A fishhook, several days old, beginning to suppurate. "You haven't told your mother," Lysandra said. "She'd have taken me to the minister," the girl said. "I didn't want prayers. I wanted it fixed." Her name was Effie Grant, and she sat perfectly still while Lysandra cleaned and dressed the wound, and she watched every step of the process with the alert attention of a child who is storing information for later use. When it was done, she slid off the table and examined her bandaged hand with satisfaction. "Will you tell her?" Effie asked. "I'll send a note that says you were treated for a minor cut and are well," Lysandra said. "The rest is between us." Effie considered this arrangement and found it acceptable. She left. Her mother arrived the following morning to say thank you, and stayed an hour, and told 3 women at the well. And after that, the dispensary had a different quality of visitors. Not only the desperate, but the prudent, the curious, and the mothers of daughters. In those 6 months, Lysandra was touched more often than she had been in her adult life at Cairnmore. Tenant women took her hand when she delivered good news. Mrs. Ada Balfour patted her arm every time they met, as though checking that she was still there. Children leaned against her at the dispensary table with the unconscious trust of small animals. None of it was from Aldrich. She noticed this and filed it, and continued working. In month 3, a letter arrived at Cairnmore from Mr. Even Carswell, Edinburgh solicitor, confirming that he had accepted the commission to locate Miss Weir and would report when he had done so. Aldrich read it in the library, folded it, and set it on the desk beside the single word Lysandra had left in her note. Not a sentence, just a word, written in her precise hand at the bottom of 4 careful sentences. He had read the note many times. He understood the 4 sentences. He did not yet fully understand the word, which was inventory. In month 4, Lysandra wrote a letter to Aldrich at the dispensary table, after the last patient had gone and the fire was low. She wrote 2 pages. She described, in the specific language of a woman trained to describe rather than to accuse, exactly what she had heard, exactly what she had understood, and exactly what she had done about it. She wrote clearly and without sentiment, and when she read it back, she found it was the most honest thing she had ever written, and she held it over the candle flame and watched it burn. In month 7, Mr. Carswell arrived at the dispensary door on a Tuesday morning while Lysandra was compounding a tincture of valerian and white willow bark for Mrs. Grant's mother, who had not slept properly in 3 months. Carswell was a neat man in a gray coat, and he presented his card with the courtesy of a professional who understood that what he was doing was unwelcome and intended to do it graciously anyway. "Mr. Aldrich Marchmain has asked me to convey his wish that you return to Cairnmore," Carswell said. "He is prepared to offer—" "No," Lysandra said. She did not look up from the mortar. "Thank you for making the journey. The road from Edinburgh is long." "Miss Weir," Carswell began, "Mrs. Balfour, in this parish." She set the pestle down, measured the tincture into the glass bottle, stoppered it, and wrote the label. "I have patients this afternoon, Mr. Carswell. I won't detain you." Carswell looked around the dispensary, the drying herbs in the window, the rows of labeled bottles, the treatment table worn smooth at the edge from 3 years of her father's practice, and now 6 months of hers. And he left without saying anything further. She heard his horse on the lane for a moment, and then it was quiet. In month 9, she wrote the second letter. It was shorter than the first. She described only one thing: the night she had asked him about marriage, and he had said yes on terms she had not known existed, and what it had cost her to understand, 12 months later, that his yes had been a different yes than hers. She held this one over the flame before she had finished reading it back, because she found she was less interested in his understanding it than she had been in month 4, and that this was not hardness, but a different kind of clarity. At Cairnmore, Aldrich received no answer from Carswell's visit and sat with it. He had expected an answer. He had expected, if he was honest, that the answer would eventually be a return, because that was what his understanding of the situation predicted. And his understanding of the situation had served him adequately for 36 years, and he had not yet been given a reason to examine what it rested on. He sat in the library with the note in his hand, and the single word at the bottom, and thought about the word inventory. For the fourth time that month, and for the fourth time did not quite arrive at what it meant. On a Tuesday morning in month 10, Lysandra was compounding a cough syrup, honey, thyme, and a measured quantity of licorice root, when the dispensary door opened and a man in a county suit came in. He was not a patient. His posture said official business, and his expression said he found the business unpleasant, which Lysandra had learned was sometimes a good sign in a man, and sometimes not. He set the papers on her workbench. "Consistory Court of Edinburgh," he said. "You are Miss Lysandra Weir, formerly of Cairnmore House?" "I am," Lysandra said. "I am required to serve you with this summons." Lysandra looked at the papers. She read enough to identify them. The court, the plaintiff, the nature of the claim, which was return of property and restitution. She picked up the pen from the workbench, signed the acceptance of service, and set the pen down. Then she picked up the pestle and finished the compounding. The sheriff officer waited for a moment, as though expecting something further, and when nothing came, he left. Lysandra decanted the cough syrup into 3 bottles, labeled them, set them on the shelf, and washed the mortar. Then she sat down at the small table by the window and read the papers fully. It took 20 minutes. When she had finished, she sat for a moment looking at the dispensary, the shelves, the instruments, the worn table, the herbs drying in the November window. And she thought about what she had built here in 10 months on credit, and her father's knowledge, and the willingness to work through 2 nights for a woman with pleurisy. Then she took out her writing paper and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Reverend Balfour, informing him of the summons and asking for his counsel regarding the parish. The second was to Mrs. Pettifer at Cairnmore, whom she had known for 3 years and trusted, asking whether Mrs. Pettifer would be willing to speak to what she had observed. The third was to Mr. Ferguson of Edinburgh, whose name she had from her father's professional correspondence, asking whether he would take her case on credit against the practice, and stating plainly what the practice was worth and what she was able to offer. She posted all 3 before she went to bed. By the time she rose in the morning and opened the dispensary, Ferguson had been written to, and the suit had changed its nature entirely. It was no longer a thing happening to her. It was a thing she would answer, in her own words, with her own witnesses, in Edinburgh, in the spring. In month 11, a letter arrived at Cairnmore from Bath in Lady Eleanor Marchmain's hand. Aldrich recognized the handwriting and carried the letter to the library to read it privately, which was where he read everything that required privacy, and which was where this letter required more than most. His mother wrote without preamble. She wrote that in 1797, when Aldrich was 9 years old, she had packed 2 trunks and carried both children in the carriage as far as the posting inn at Kelso before she turned back. She had tried to leave his father. She had reached the inn, and she had sat in the public room with Aldrich asleep against her arm and his sister on the bench opposite. And she had looked at the road north and understood that she was frightened. Not of his father, not of poverty, but of the carrying of it. The full weight of both children, and no house, and no practice, and no name that was hers. And she had turned back. She had told no one. She'd stayed for 31 more years, and she had not been content. She had been afraid, and she had made of her fear a kind of order, and she had allowed her children to believe that the order was chosen. "I am writing this now," she said, "because I should have written it when you were 9. I am sorry that I did not. Whatever you do with it is your business. I have told you the truth, and that is all I can do." Aldrich read the letter. He read it again. He set it on the desk and stood and walked out of the library and out of the house and into the yew alley. And he walked the length of it and back and the length of it again, without his coat in November, for an hour. Rennick the butler appeared at the end of the alley at some point, with his coat over one arm, and stood there without speaking until Aldrich stopped walking and put it on. He did not retract the suit. He understood. Sitting in the library that evening with his mother's letter and Lysandra's notes side by side on the desk. That understanding a thing and dismantling what you have built on it are not the same action and do not happen on the same day. The suit moved forward. "In month 13, Mr. Ferguson wrote to Lady Winifred Marchmain at her rooms in Edinburgh, requesting her deposition. Lady Winifred, who had received Lysandra's note on her nightstand 14 months ago and had read it many times since, agreed immediately and was articulate. Mrs. Pettifer, who had kept house at Cairnmore for 20 years and observed a great deal, agreed to travel to Edinburgh at her own cost and did so without informing Aldrich, which was the kind of thing Mrs. Pettifer was capable of, and which Aldrich, had he known, would have found instructive about the quality of the household he had believed was content. In month 14, the night before the hearings opened, Lysandra wrote the third letter to Aldrich at the dispensary table. She wrote it quickly and without stopping, and it was the most private thing she had ever put on paper. And she read it once and held it over the candle and watched every word of it become act. Then she laid out the étui, the Culpeper, and her written inventory of everything she had brought from Cairnmore and everything she had built since, checked each item, and packed for Edinburgh. The consistory court of Edinburgh sat in a chamber that smelled of old paper and candle wax. And the bench was occupied by 3 men who had heard a great many cases of disputed property and returned persons, and who had, Lysandra suspected, heard very few cases where the respondent arrived with a written inventory, her own counsel, a deposition from the plaintiff's aunt, and the testimony of a housekeeper who had traveled 2 days to be present. Aldrich was not in the chamber during her testimony. This was the court's arrangement, and she had not asked for it. But she noted his absence as she took her place and found that it made her neither easier nor more difficult. She had not prepared for an audience. She had prepared for a record. Ferguson led her through the testimony with the methodical calm of a man who trusted his documents. Lysandra named the assumed name adoption at Glen Strathorrin without being asked. She offered it before the bench could raise it, naming Reverend Balfour's arrangement and the reasons for it, and the bench noted this. She confirmed the étui's origin, which was Lady Winifred's gift and not Aldrich's, and produced the written record of it. She presented her inventory, what she had brought from Cairnmore, itemized, and what she had built in Glen Strathorrin, itemized, and the credit arrangement with Ferguson, which demonstrated that she had acquired legal representation through her own means, not through any patron's intercession. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not perform distress, and she did not perform composure. She described, in the specific language her father had taught her, exact, unadorned, sufficient, the facts of her situation as they had existed and as they now existed. And she answered every question the bench put to her in the same register. The ruling came the following morning. The suit was dismissed with costs. The bench's written commendation of her candor appeared in the Caledonian Mercury 2 days later. 3 sentences in the legal notices column, precise and public and permanent. At Cairnmore, Aldrich read it at the breakfast table. He read it twice. He set the paper down on the white cloth beside his cup and stood and walked out of the breakfast room and out of the house. And Rennick found his coat on the chair and carried it to him at the end of the yew alley, which was where Aldrich had stopped walking and was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. "Thank you, Rennick," Aldrich said. Rennick replied quietly, "Yes, Your Grace," and went back inside. The following Tuesday, a 10-sentence letter appeared in the Caledonian Mercury, signed by Lord Aldrich Marchmain, Duke of Cairnmore, resigning his Scottish representative peerage. The letter was measured and specific, and offered no explanation beyond a brief statement of personal grounds. It did not name her. It did not need to. Lady Winifred, reading it over her morning coffee in Edinburgh, arranged her retirement to Musselburgh that same week, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for permission she had not realized she was waiting for. Lady Eleanor Marchmain, in Bath, wrote Lysandra 3 sentences. She had told her son what she should have told him at 9. Whatever Lysandra did next was no business of hers. She wished her well. Lysandra read the letter at the dispensary table, set it in the drawer of the writing table, and closed the drawer. She did not answer it. She opened the dispensary and saw her morning patients and compounded what needed compounding, and did not think about the drawer until evening. And by evening, she had decided that the letter had said what it needed to say, and so had she, and that was sufficient. In month 16, a boy on a pony arrived at the dispensary with a note. The note was brief, Aldrich's hand, which she recognized, requesting one meeting on ground of her choosing, at a time of her choosing, with no obligation implied by her consent. Lysandra read it twice, set it on the workbench, and continued with what she was doing. That evening, she wrote 3 sentences in reply, and sent them back by the same boy, who was waiting at the manse gate with the air of a child who had been told to wait and intended to do so indefinitely. "Tuesday next," she wrote. "The loch shore below the manse, 3 o'clock. No servant." He came on foot. She saw him on the road from the dispensary window at 2:30, a figure on the lane from the coaching inn, 8 miles off, which meant he had left the inn before 7 in the morning to arrive at 3 on foot, which was the kind of thing Aldrich did when he could not sit still, and which she had known about him for 4 years without ever having had occasion to remark on it. She was at the loch shore at 3. She wore her wool working dress and her cloak, and she had her hands in her pockets and her father's scales in the basket at her feet, because she had been going to Mrs. Grant's after this, regardless of how it went. And she did not rearrange her afternoon for anyone. Aldrich came down the path from the lane and stopped at 6 feet. He was thinner than she remembered, and his coat was the wrong coat for the weather, and he had walked 8 miles, and it showed. He did not close the distance. He said, "I read your testimony in the Current." "I know," Lysandra said. "It was in the Current." "Twice," he said. "I read it twice." He stopped. He looked at the lochs for a moment and then back at her. "My mother wrote me a letter in November. She told me about Kelso, about 1797, when I was 9. She had tried to leave my father, and she turned back at the posting inn because she was frightened. And I didn't know that. I had never known that. And everything I believed about how things worked, about what women in a certain situation chose, was built on a 30-year silence that she had never intended me to hear as a rule." He paused. "I filed the suit after I received that letter. I knew better, and I filed it anyway. I want you to understand that I was not only ignorant, I was also, for some months, unwilling to be otherwise." Lysandra looked at him. She let him finish, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke. "First," she said, "you said in your library to Lord Everard that I would stay because women in my position do. You said it the way you say something that requires no examination. I had been in your house for 3 years and in your bed for 12 months, and you had not once asked me what I thought about my position, or what I had given up to be in it, or what I understood the arrangement to mean. You assumed. I do not require you to feel worse about it than you already do. I require you to understand that the sentence was not a lapse. It was the whole of what you had built. Aldrich did not speak. Second, Lysandra said, in 10 months I opened a dispensary, treated a pleurisy that should have been fatal, built a practice on credit, engaged my own counsel, and answered your suit in Edinburgh with an inventory. I did not do this to prove something to you. I did it because it was what I had been trained to do and had not been permitted to do until I left. I am telling you so that you understand what you were the cost of and what the cost purchased. The wind off the lock moved the hem of her cloak. Aldrich stood very still. Third, Lysandra said, if you wish to write to me, you may write by the same boy next spring, not sooner. I will answer or I will not. I do not owe you an answer, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I will not refuse in advance what I am not yet certain of. She picked up the basket. Good afternoon. She walked to the manse. She heard him on the path behind her for a moment, not following, simply standing. And then she heard nothing more, because the manse door was between her and the lock, and she was inside. He walked the 8 miles back to the inn. She knew this because the boy told her the following week, with the detailed accuracy of a child who had found the whole arrangement extremely interesting. The following Tuesday, the resignation letter appeared in the Caledonian Mercury. The following spring, the same boy arrived at the dispensary gate with a note. Lysandra read it at the workbench, folded it, put it in her pocket, and sent an answer back that afternoon. She met him on the Tuesday. They walked the path above the lock for an hour without saying much. The parish, the dispensary's winter cases, the road conditions from Edinburgh, the price of licorice root, which had gone up again. On the second Tuesday they talked for longer, and she told him about Mrs. Ada Balfour's recovery, and he told her about the yew alley and the state of the home farm since he had let the factor go. And she asked several direct questions about the factor's dismissal, and he answered them with the slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who has recently learned that being questioned is not the same as being attacked. On the third Tuesday it rained, and they stood under the ash trees at the bend of the path. And he told her, without being asked, that he had not fully understood until he read her testimony. Not the ruling, the testimony itself. What it had cost her to reduce her father's practice to household remedies for 12 years, and that he had read that part 4 times and not found a way to make it smaller than it was. You weren't meant to, Lysandra said. No, Aldrich said. I know. On the 4th Tuesday, the path turned at the stand of hawthorn, and the wind had been coming off the hill all morning and had turned Aldrich's collar up at the back in the way that meant it would be cold against his neck for the rest of the walk. Lysandra stopped. She turned. She reached up and pressed the collar flat with her fingers 3 seconds, her hand briefly at the back of his neck. And then she withdrew it and walked on. He fell into step beside her without comment, though she noticed that he did not speak for another 1/4 mile. And when he did, his voice had a different quality than it had before. Quieter, more careful, as though he had understood that something had just been offered and intended not to be careless with it. 11 months after that, on a Saturday morning in October, Reverend James Balfour officiated a small wedding at the parish church of Glen Strathorrin. There were 14 people present. Effie Grant was in the front pew in her good dress, having appointed herself to this position without being asked and having been found there when Lysandra arrived. At which point it had seemed both unnecessary and unkind to move her. Lady Winifred had come up from Musselburgh the day before and was seated beside Mrs. Ada Balfour. The two of them having discovered in the vestibule that they shared a view on the management of parish affairs and the inadequacy of most men's hats, and having formed on this basis an immediate and apparently permanent friendship. Lysandra wore grey wool and the silver étui at her wrist. She carried no flowers. She had the rings in her pocket and produced them at the correct moment with the practical efficiency of a woman who had organized the event herself and intended it to proceed correctly. After, in the manse, there was a small supper, and then the guests went home, and the manse was quiet. That evening, in the dispensary below the bedroom, Lysandra ground comfrey at the workbench. The candle was lit. The fire was adequate. Aldrich sat by the window in the chair she had placed there 2 months ago, on a Tuesday when she had decided the window was the best light for reading. With his book on Scottish parish law open on his knee, because he was learning the framework of the parish in the methodical way of a man who had decided to understand the place he had come to live in, and who understood that understanding it required reading rather than assuming. There was a knock at the dispensary door. Mrs. Grant came in with Effie behind her, Effie holding up her right hand, which had a cut across the palm from the edge of a net she had been helping her father mend. "It's not deep," Mrs. Grant said, "but it wouldn't stop bleeding." "Sit down," Lysandra said, and Effie climbed onto the treatment table with the ease of long practice. Aldrich rose without being asked. He crossed to the basin on the side table, filled it from the ewer, and carried it to the workbench and held it while Lysandra cleaned the cut. Effie watched the procedure with her customary attentiveness, and when the dressing was applied, she looked at Aldrich with the appraising directness that was her particular quality. "Are you Mrs. Balfour's husband now?" Effie asked. "Mrs. Halgrave's," Aldrich said, without looking up from the basin. "Mrs. Balfour was her name before. She is Mrs. Halgrave now." Effie considered this. "She can be both," Effie said, with the tone of someone settling a question that had been unnecessarily complicated. "I'll remember both." "That seems right," Aldrich said. Mrs. Grant thanked Lysandra, collected Effie, and they left. The dispensary was quiet again. Lysandra dried her hands on the cloth hanging at the workbench. Aldrich reached for the towel at the same moment, and their fingers met on the cloth. A brief contact, unhurried, neither of them pulling away or making anything of it. And then he set the towel down and returned to his chair, and his book, and she returned to the comfrey. The fire burned steadily. The candle on the workbench made a small warm circle of light. Outside the window, the loch was dark, and the hills were dark, and the parish was settling into its evening. And in the manse dispensary the comfrey was ground, and the book was read, and the evening was ordinary in every particular. Ordinary and chosen, and entirely, irreversibly hers.